They say the collapse began with a missing invoice, but they're wrong. It began with me, alone, again. 3 hours before dawn, wrist deep in a failing script that no one else remembered existed. While the rest of the office slept off their startup cocktails and keynote dreams, I was hand-feeding the payment processor through another night cycle, whispering to an aging stack of systems like a ghost keeping the lights on in a house no one believed was haunted. My name is Arya. You won't find it on any plaques or slide decks, but for a decade, I was the gravity, the quiet weight beneath their momentum. I wrote the billing logic they called magic, maintained the compliance processes they assumed were automatic. Back when we still ran our servers off a fold-out table next to the mini-fridge that hummed like a prayer, I was indispensable. They called me a magician then. Now I was just ops. Lowercase. The woman they looped in when a client asked how something worked, and no one had the answer. I became their muscle memory. And like muscle, they only noticed me when something tore. But I didn't tear. I adapted. I automated the security processes our CTO promised would be ready by Q2. It was already Q4. I had done it manually for 3 years. No one asked. No one thanked. They assumed. That's what they were good at. Assuming. Assuming the billing server was real. Assuming the renewal pings just happened. Assuming their dashboards updated themselves. The interns called me a rock star, but only when things broke. The execs never asked me how anything worked. They just clapped when it didn't burn down. And I let them, because applause was cheap and systems were sacred. I wasn't hungry for praise. I was starving for stability. I thought if I made myself essential enough, they'd never let me go. But essential doesn't mean visible. It just means convenient. Until it doesn't. Until 2 a.m., when your phone buzzes and HR tells you your role is redundant, not with a voice, not with a meeting, with a message. 10 words, no name, no warmth. A digital guillotine set for 8 a.m. I didn't scream. I didn't beg. I didn't even log out. I simply stopped. I stopped saving them, stopped catching the fires before they lit. Because here's the thing they never understood. I wasn't the insurance policy. I was the system, the kill switch, the manual override, the quiet breath in the server room that kept everything alive. And when I exhaled for the last time, so did everything else. They called me redundant, but the truth was simpler and colder. I was the last thread in their tapestry of illusion. And when they cut it, the unraveling wasn't sabotage. It was gravity doing its job. I didn't burn it down. I just walked away. They didn't even notice when I started disappearing. Not all at once, just a little less Arya each day. First, my name vanished from the quarterly review invites. Then from the dashboards I built. The ones they now polished with pastel color schemes and called intuitive. I stopped correcting them. Let them think the license reminders were cloud magic and not my sleepless nights. I watched as the systems I nurtured like brittle glass were renamed, rebranded, repackaged with someone else's initials. There's a unique sting in watching a process you birthed get explained to you by an intern holding a printout of your own deprecated documentation. He smiled like he was teaching me something. I smiled back like I didn't remember every line of code he was pretending to understand. They thought they were streamlining, innovating, cutting fat. But I wasn't fat. I was the spine, and they'd just slipped a scalpel between my vertebrae thinking they were trimming cost. After the holiday party, yes, the one I missed while exporting EOI compliance manually, the mask cracked. I didn't get a bonus. I didn't even get a plate of catered food. I got silence. The kind of silence that sounds like inevitability. That's when I knew. I wasn't just overlooked. I was being erased. Not by accident, by design. It's cleaner that way. Easier to tell the board you're evolving when there's one less shadow in the room reminding them what stability actually costs. So I stopped fixing things. Not dramatically, just enough. A sync batch left paused. A credential renewal gently missed. I let entropy do what it does best, reclaim. And still, nothing. No questions. No follow-ups. No alarms. They'd built their little paper palace on top of my bones and assumed the floor would never buckle. Then came the text. The guillotine. And while the blade hovered, I opened my laptop one last time. Not to delete, not to destroy, to observe, like a scientist watching the specimen finally realize it's trapped. The dashboards were already screaming. Silent alerts piling up like snow in a city that stopped believing in winter. The expiration flags, the unsynced contracts, the dead cron jobs. Every red light a love letter they'd never read. I didn't write code for revenge. I wrote it to keep them safe from themselves. And when I stopped, the system didn't crash. It simply lost its heartbeat. I watched as they scrambled. The panic didn't come in fire. It came in confusion, the kind that spreads like ink in water. Slack threads lit up like a bonfire, each message a match tossed blindly into the dark. Did something update overnight? Can we restart the billing server? There was no server, just me, wrapped around their fragile processes like duct tape and devotion. I sat there, not angry, not triumphant, just free. Like a ghost finally leaving the house it died in. And somewhere in that building, with its frosted glass walls and ergonomic lies, a CFO was whispering the truth out loud. Where is the money? The answer was simple. It went where I went, not because I took it, but because I was the map. And they never learned to read it. They always assumed I'd stay. That no matter how far they pushed me into the margins, I'd still be there to clean up the mess. Like gravity, taken for granted until the floor disappears. At 8:01 a.m., they finally pulled the plug on my access. But the damage was already whispering through the walls. Not explosive, not cinematic. Just the quiet, slow unspooling of a system no one understood because they never asked how it worked. And I never made them. I was too busy holding up the ceiling with one hand and patching leaks with the other. They called it resilience. I called it exhaustion. The CFO was already shouting into a Zoom void by the time the first failed invoice hit his inbox. Clients were confused. Some assumed the company had gone under. Others asked if they still owed us money. I watched it unfold like a slow-motion collapse. Not because I wanted revenge, but because I needed the silence. I needed to know what would happen when I finally stopped catching the plates they kept spinning. Turns out, they all hit the ground at once. The interns blamed it. It blamed a phantom server. One executive actually suggested rebooting billing, as if you could restart a person. As if I could be booted up like a machine after they stripped out every piece of context and called it optimization. I was their process. Not part of it. The whole damn thing. The compliance exports, the auto-renewals, the metadata mappings, all living in my head, wrapped in a web of logic and anxiety I never had the luxury to share. Not because I didn't want to, but because no one ever stayed long enough to listen. I wrote documentation, pages of it, detailed, redundant, idiot-proof, marked private, of course, because they told me visibility was a bottleneck, so I became invisible by design, a self-erasing blueprint they didn't bother to print. And now they were clawing at shadows. Slack lit up with names they'd forgotten. Mine was suddenly on everyone's lips. Not out of respect, out of panic. I received a message from legal at 10:12 a.m. All caps. Where are the Q2 filings? I almost laughed. The batch job was paused, had been for 8 days. I flagged it, tagged 3 people. No one replied. They called me paranoid, told me to delegate, said I'd burn out. I did, just not in flames, in silence. The kind that doesn't announce itself, just slips out the side door and lets the building figure out what's missing. They reached out, of course. Desperate pings, pleas disguised as politeness. Sorry about everything. Hope we can still be friends. Friends don't fire you at 2 a.m. with a copy-paste message and then ask you to save the house you built for them. They thought this was about ego. It wasn't. It was about gravity. And gravity doesn't hold grudges. It just lets go. By noon, they stopped pretending it was a glitch. The numbers were no longer rounding errors or momentary sync delays. The money was gone. Not stolen. Not siphoned. Just absent. Like breath in a corpse. $95 million, scattered across a back end no one bothered to understand. And somewhere between the frozen dashboards and the blinking red integrations, a truth settled in their bones. Arya wasn't coming back. I watched it unfold from a cafe window 2 blocks away, sipping burnt coffee from a paper cup that cost more than their last recognition bonus. The irony was artful. I used to sit in this very spot on lunch breaks I never really took, drafting escalation plans for systems no one thanked me for keeping upright. And now, the same systems were choking on their own importance. They called in a crisis firm by 12:30, the kind with bulletproof vests for their egos and buzzwords for their failures. One of them actually asked if I'd left behind a master override, as if I were a villain in a movie, leaving ticking time bombs and smug clues. No, I didn't sabotage anything. I just stopped saving them. I had become so woven into the fabric of their survival that my absence felt like malice. But it wasn't malice, it was math. They extracted my labor, my logic, my late nights, and labeled them overhead. Then they clipped the wire and acted surprised when the circuit died. It wasn't an act of revenge. It was cause and effect. The last line of the last script I ever wrote for them was elegant, silent, and perfectly timed. A simple pause. Not a delete. Not destruction. Just stillness. And stillness is lethal when you build an empire on motion. By 1, they were digging through backups, versioning history, half-built SOPs. Like archaeologists piecing together a dead language they never learned to speak. The CTO looked calm on the outside, but I knew that look. That was the face of a man finally realizing he'd never understood the product he sold. Not really. Not past the pitch decks. Not past me. I got a call I didn't answer. Then 3 more. Then one from a number I knew by heart but hadn't heard from since the last funding round. He left a voicemail, said he understood things got messy, and that there might be room to revisit terms. Terms. As if I were a contract they forgot to renegotiate instead of the architect they ghosted. I deleted the message, not out of spite, out of clarity, because I wasn't going to be the net they fell into anymore. I was the height they forgot they were standing on. And now the fall was inevitable. Somewhere around 2 p.m., the firm issued a press release. Unforeseen technical issues impacting operations. No mention of me. No mention of the system they dismantled with smiles and synergy and a 2 a.m. text message. But it didn't matter. The investors were already circling, not like hawks, like crows. Patient, familiar with death. I finished my coffee. Walked past their building one last time. Frosted glass. Quiet panic behind it. And I smiled. Not because they lost $95 million, but because for the first time in a decade, they finally realized what I was worth. They used to joke that I was the fail-safe, the human patch, the last good deploy in a company running on wishful thinking and empty JIRA tickets. But fail-safes are only useful if you don't fire them at 2 a.m. and pretend the system will still hold. By 3 p.m., legal had entered stage 2 of their cycle, denial wrapped in discovery. Someone claimed I had breached policy by not handing off proprietary knowledge, as if my mind was a folder they could drag into shared drive and call it continuity. I didn't reply. There was nothing left to defend. I hadn't taken anything with me. That was the problem. Everything they lost was what I never got credit for building. Lines of logic I whispered into brittle pipelines at midnight. Contingencies I invented out of caffeine and fear because they kept skipping retros and lying in boardroom slides. They never noticed the magic while it worked, only the absence when it stopped. The new ops lead, poor thing, just 3 weeks in, posted a frantic question in the internal Slack. Something about renewal sequencing and legacy clients. 3 minutes later, the entire channel went dark. Not offline, just silent. The kind of silence that says we're in over our heads and the person who knew how to swim was the one we pushed overboard. I heard they tried to bring in a consultant. He lasted 4 hours. Said the stack was a house of cards, duct-taped to a roller coaster. I took it as a compliment. They meant it as an indictment. But chaos in my hands had structure. In theirs, it had gravity. They kept falling. By 4 p.m., the CFO had reportedly locked herself in a meeting room and was redlining expense reports like she could manifest liquidity by slashing office plants and oat milk. Too late, the leak wasn't in the budget, it was in the foundation. And I had been the sealant, the unpaid insurance policy they discarded because someone promised streamlined headcount would please the board. I imagine they're rethinking that now. The irony was, I had documented everything. Not in the Google Drive, in the product, in every silent safeguard, in every redundant trigger, in every error message crafted like a riddle only I could solve. Not out of malice, out of habit. Because when you're the only one awake at 2 a.m. saving a company that doesn't remember your name, you start to talk to the system like it's a diary. And now they were reading it backwards, blindfolded, bleeding. At 4:45 p.m., someone leaked a screenshot. Investors pulling out. Series D frozen. The valuation dropped by 8 figures in 30 minutes. I closed my laptop. Not because I was done watching, but because I'd already seen this story play out in my head too many times to find the ending satisfying. I wasn't vindicated. I was empty, like a room finally cleared of smoke. Not better, just honest. They'll survive, maybe. Some new leader will come in, promise reinvention, slap a new coat of culture on the same old cracks. That's fine. Let them rebuild. Let them pretend they learned. But I won't be there. Not this time. Because gravity, once it lets go, doesn't return. It just watches from a distance as the tower tries to rise again, forgetting what made it fall. They say the market has no memory, but people do. And memories, when bruised, become stories, then rumors, then questions in glossy pitch decks delivered with nervous hands. By the end of that week, my name was everywhere and nowhere. Not tagged, not traced, just spoken in half sentences at networking events and whispered in elevator pauses like a ghost that smelled of scorched code and vanished profits. Aria. She just disappeared. No lawsuit, no LinkedIn update, just silence, and a $95 million echo. Some said I was hired by a competitor. Others claimed I went off-grid, building something in a shadow fund with teeth and vengeance. I let them guess. Myth was safer than fact, because the fact was, I didn't need to speak. The system spoke for me. Every broken function, every dollar misrouted, every line of brittle code I used to patch daily just by existing, now sang a requiem for the version of me they tried to erase. It turns out, when you treat a human like infrastructure, you shouldn't be surprised when pulling her out feels like collapse. A recruiter from a firm that once declined me 3 times now called me visionary. She offered equity, bonuses, a corner office. I declined. Not because I was bitter, because I was finished playing backup dancer to men who choreograph chaos and call it innovation. I spent my mornings differently now. No dashboards, no 6 a.m. alerts pinging my sanity into submission. Just coffee and quiet. Sometimes I'd scroll the headlines, watch the slow-motion implosion of the company that once told me I was replaceable. They rebranded last week. New logo, new mission statement, same cracks. I smiled, not out of cruelty, but recognition. You can change the paint. You can even swap the floors. But the rot? It starts in the beams, and I was the last one holding them up. One of my former interns, sweet, brilliant, perpetually undervalued, messaged me. She asked how I knew when it was time to go. I told her it wasn't a decision. It was an awakening. Like realizing you've been holding your breath for so long you forgot what air felt like. She replied with a single word. Understood. That was enough. The truth is, there's no glory in being right too late. No satisfaction in watching the fire when you are the one keeping the water flowing. But there is peace in knowing you didn't strike the match. You just walked away from the room that insisted on burning itself down. I started writing again. Not code. Words. Stories like this one. Fictionalized, of course. Names changed. Timelines blurred. But the core? Untouched. Because this wasn't just my story. It was the story of every woman turned ghost in a server room. Every strategist called too intense. Every architect erased from a roadmap until the structure failed. The industry will move on. They always do. Headlines fade. Companies die and reincarnate with the same sins under new slogans. But I won't fade. I won't reincarnate. I'll evolve. Quietly. Brilliantly. Far from their boardrooms, but forever in their nightmares. Because now they know. Some code can't be rewritten. Some systems collapse not from sabotage, but from subtraction. And some women, once forgotten, don't return. They rebuild. Somewhere else. Higher. Alone, but never small again. I didn't plan to return. Not in any version of the story I told myself while the world clapped for failures wearing $1,000 suits. But fate has a fondness for irony, and it found me in the form of an email from a firm whose name once made my skin bristle. A name that sat at the head of the table the day I was deemed redundant, whose directors thought they could bury legacy under stock options and pretend I hadn't built the bones they were still chewing on like vultures trying to taste vision. The subject line simply read, "Are you open to a conversation, Arya?" I almost laughed, but the silence in my new life had sharpened my senses, not dulled them, and I knew better than to dismiss a spark without checking for gasoline beneath the floorboards, so I replied with one word. Perhaps the meeting was virtual, of course, sanitized by lighting filters and voices modulated to sound more humble than they were. The man on screen had once called my methods unscalable. Now he described them as prophetic. He smiled like we were equals, like time had flattened the betrayal into a harmless wrinkle. And I let him speak, because sometimes power is patience dressed as disinterest. And he told me they were building something new, agile, resilient, future-facing, as if the future was a direction and not a reckoning. Then he asked if I'd be willing to advise. Just advise, not join, not commit, just offer perspective. As if I hadn't already done that for free while they ignored me and chased IPOs with blindfolds on. I told him I'd consider it, which was true, but not in the way he thought, because what I considered wasn't the offer, it was the leverage, the weight of my silence. The value of a whisper when everyone else is screaming into the void of a collapsing model? I slept on it for 3 nights, not out of uncertainty, but ritual. On the 4th, I sent a counteroffer, not in dollars, but in terms. My terms: autonomy, veto power, and a single clause buried in the language. Subtle, but absolute. Full access. They agreed faster than I expected. Desperation tends to dull negotiation. And just like that, I was back. Not in the system, but above it. Watching, correcting, removing, replacing a scalpel in a place built on duct tape. I didn't seek revenge. I engineered balance quietly, efficiently, while they paraded innovation in boardroom monologues I had ghostwritten. I watched departments restructure themselves out of relevance, watched leaders exit under the soft cloak of mutual decisions, watched the architecture bend towards something unfamiliar. Truth. They thought they were salvaging the company, but really, they were just making it survivable. Finally, and not because they changed, but because I returned, not as a savior, not as a martyr, but as a reminder that systems forget, but code remembers, and I had written my name in every loop they once refused to debug. Now, they speak of transformation, of lessons learned, of evolution. But I know better. Change doesn't come from slogans or strategy decks. It comes when the ghost you buried walks back in, not to haunt you, but to rebuild the house you burned down and charge you rent for the ashes. Sometimes, being erased is the greatest freedom. Arya's story reminds us that what feels like an ending is often the moment just before reinvention. When systems fail to see your worth, it isn't a reflection of your value. It's a reflection of their blindness. Walking away isn't weakness. It's strategy. Choosing not to fight a broken structure, but instead to build something better elsewhere, is an act of power. And when you return, not with anger, but with clarity, you change more than roles. You change the rules. The lesson here is simple. Know when to stay silent and when to strike with precision. You don't need to burn bridges to move forward. Sometimes you just need to let the bridge collapse under its own weight. Growth isn't always loud. Success doesn't always look like a title. Real strength is found in the quiet moments, when you refuse to settle, when you choose dignity over drama, when you let your work speak after you've left the room. So if you've ever been undervalued, misjudged, or silenced, remember this: you are not the role they gave you. You are the architect of what comes next.